Welcome to Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. Today's story is about the high cost of a perfect life and the one secret that can turn a home into a tomb. But before we begin, I have a question for you, and I want you to be brutally honest in the comments below. If you walked into your kitchen and found the person you love standing over a body, would your first instinct be to call the police, or would you grab a mop? Where does your loyalty end and your morality begin? Most of us think we know the answer, but until the floor is wet with someone else's life, you have no idea what you're capable of. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Is there any crime you would cover up for love? This is I Stayed Silent for 12 years, then one letter changed everything. The night my life ended didn't start with a bang. It started with the mundane sound of a key turning in a lock and the smell of the rainy Thursday air blowing into the hallway. I was in the kitchen, plating dinner, thinking about the trivial stresses of my day, when Elias walked in. He didn't say hello. He didn't take off his coat. He just stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his chest heaving as if he had run a marathon, his face a ghostly, sickly shade of gray. I remember looking down at his shoes first. His expensive leather loafers were ruined, caked in thick, dark mud and something else, something wet and crimson that was beginning to drip onto our white tile floor. My heart didn't just race, it stopped. I looked up at his hands, and that's when I saw the jagged tear in his shirt and the frantic, wide-eyed terror in his gaze. He didn't have to say a word for me to know that the world we had spent 12 years building was about to be burned to the ground. I didn't scream. I didn't run for the phone. In that split second, a cold, survivalist instinct I didn't know I possessed took over. I simply set the plates down, folded my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking, and stared at the red stains spreading across the tile. I chose silence before he even opened his mouth to confess. "It was Leela," he finally rasped, the name coming out like a curse. Everyone knew Leela, the 22-year-old girl from the cafe who had been the subject of neighborhood gossip for months because of how Elias looked at her. He started babbling, the words tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent stream. He told me they had been arguing in the park by the ravine. He told me she was going to tell everyone about their friendship, that she was going to ruin his reputation, his business, and our marriage. He said he just wanted to quiet her down, that he only pushed her to get her away from him, but the ground was slick from the rain. He described the sound of her head hitting the rocks at the bottom of the slope with a clinical, horrifying detail that I can still hear when the house gets too quiet at night. He looked at me, pleading for a lifeline, begging me to tell him it was an accident. But as I looked at the blood on his cuff, I realized it didn't matter what he called it. The girl was dead, and the man I loved was a killer. In that moment, I had two choices. I could be the woman who did the right thing and spent the rest of her life as the widow of a murderer, or I could be the woman who kept her mouth shut and kept her life. I looked at the mud on the floor, grabbed a cloth, and started to scrub. That was the first day of a 12-year sentence I gave myself. By the time the clock struck midnight, the kitchen was spotless. We had burned his clothes in the backyard incinerator, the smoke disappearing into the rainy night like a ghost. Elias sat at the table, his head in his hands, while I stood by the window, watching the police sirens in the distance racing toward the ravine. I realized then that I wasn't just his wife anymore. I was his vault. I had become the keeper of the most dangerous truth in the city. The police came the next day, of course. They called it a tragic accident, a young girl slipping on wet rocks in the dark. They sat in our living room, drinking the tea I served them with steady hands, praising Elias for his leadership in the community and offering their condolences for the loss of such a bright young neighbor. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, nodding at the right times, playing the role of the supportive, grieving wife to perfection. I didn't realize that every time I stayed silent, I was hammering another nail into my own coffin. I thought I was protecting Elias, but I was actually feeding a monster that would eventually turn its hunger toward me. For 12 years, we lived in that house, hosted those dinners, and attended those church services, all while the ghost of Leela sat at our table, waiting for the one thing I wasn't ready to give: the truth. Maintaining a lie of this magnitude is like holding your breath underwater. At first, it's a challenge of will, but eventually the pressure in your lungs becomes a screaming physical agony that you have to learn to ignore just to survive. After the police left our living room that first week, officially ruling Leela's death a tragic, rain-slicked accident, a strange and terrifying stillness settled over our home. We didn't talk about the ravine. We didn't talk about the mud or the smell of burning wool in the backyard. Instead, we began the meticulous daily work of constructing a fortress of normalcy. Elias became even more involved in the community, his face appearing on billboards for local fundraisers and his name etched into the brass plaques of new wing developments at the hospital. He walked with a straighter spine, spoke with a more resonant authority, and shook hands with a grip that felt like iron. To the world, he was the gold standard of a successful, grieving neighbor. But behind our front door, when the porch light flickered off and the deadbolt clicked into place, he was a hollow shell. I watched him transform into a master of the perfect mask, a man who could laugh at a dinner party while the ghost of a 22-year-old girl sat invisible at the head of our table. I became an expert at the art of the invisible wife, the quiet strength behind the great man. But my role was far more sinister. I was the curator of our deception. I was the one who checked the news every single morning for 12 years, my heart hammering against my ribs at the sight of any headline mentioning cold cases or new evidence. I was the one who made sure the neighbors saw us gardening on Saturdays, who hosted the annual block party with a smile so practiced it felt like it was stitched onto my face. Every time a siren wailed in the distance, we would both freeze for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of pure, unadulterated terror, before resuming our conversation about the weather or the stock market. We were two actors in a play that never ended, performing for an audience of ghosts. The guilt didn't hit me all at once. It was a slow, corrosive rot. It was in the way I couldn't look at the young girls at the cafe without seeing Leela's face. It was in the way I stopped going to church because the word forgiveness felt like a hot coal in my mouth. I had traded my soul for a beautiful house and a respected name, and for over 4,000 days I convinced myself it was a fair bargain. As the years bled into a decade, the weight of the silence began to manifest in physical ways. My hair started thinning, my sleep became a fractured landscape of nightmares where I was drowning in red mud, and I developed a habit of wringing my hands until the skin was raw. Elias, however, seemed to thrive on the lie. His business tripled in size. He became a man who was untouchable, protected by the very community he had betrayed. He started to believe his own narrative, that he was a victim of a terrible accident rather than a man who had pushed a girl to death to protect his own ego. He became colder, more distant, his temper flickering like a dying bulb whenever I tried to bring up the past. "It's over," he would hiss, his eyes turning into shards of ice. "We did what we had to do. Don't look back." but you can't help but look back when the path behind you is littered with the bones of the truth. We had built a life of luxury on a foundation of rot, and for 12 years I waited for the floorboards to give way. I didn't realize that the collapse wouldn't come from the police or the neighbors. It would come from a single weight envelope that arrived on a morning that felt just as ordinary as the night it all began.
The morning the letter arrived, the sun was shining with a cruel, clinical clarity that made every speck of dust in the hallway look like a witness. I remember picking up the mail from the porch, a mundane stack of utility bills and glossy grocery catalogs, but tucked deep in the middle was a plain, heavy stock envelope that made the air in my lungs turn to ice before I even saw the handwriting. There was no return address, no stamp of origin, just my name written in a sharp, deliberate script that felt like a needle pressing against my skin. My hands began to shake so violently that the rest of the mail slipped from my fingers, scattering across the hardwood floor like dry leaves, but I didn't reach for them. I carried that white envelope into the kitchen, the same kitchen where Elias had stood 12 years ago with his shoes caked in the mud of the ravine, and I sat at the table in a silence so thick it felt like I was underwater. I used a steak knife to slit the top of the paper, my breath hitching in my throat as a single glossy photograph slid out onto the mahogany surface. It was a candid shot, taken from a distance, showing Elias and Leela standing together in a wooded area I didn't recognize. It wasn't the accidental meeting he had described. In the photo, his hand was clamped around her upper arm with a terrifying white-knuckled intensity. Leela wasn't smiling. She looked small, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated fear that mirrored the exact expression I had been wearing internally for over 4,000 days. I stared at that image until the colors began to bleed together, my mind racing through every lie he had fed me since that rainy Thursday. Then I reached back into the envelope for the letter. It was a single sheet of paper, but the words written on it were enough to dismantle the entire foundation of my life in a heartbeat. "You think you protected a man who made a tragic mistake," the ink seemed to sneer. "But you protected a man who executed a plan. Leela wasn't just a girl he pushed in a moment of panic. She was a witness. She found the ledger in the basement. She knew about the funds he had been siphoning from the community foundation for years. He didn't kill her because he was angry. He killed her because she was going to the district attorney the next morning. You haven't been a loyal wife. You've been a shield for a predator. It's time to stop lying for a man who laughed at your sacrifice." The room began to spin. Every thank you he had whispered in the dark, every time he had called me his anchor or his saving grace, suddenly felt like a physical assault. He hadn't just used me to cover up a crime, he had manipulated my very soul, weaponizing my empathy to turn me into a silent gargoyle guarding his secrets. He knew that by telling me it was a mistake, I would feel a moral obligation to save him. He had tricked me into becoming a criminal so he could continue being a pillar of the community. I sat there for what felt like hours, the letter clutched so tightly in my fist that the paper began to tear. The perfect life I had spent 12 years preserving, the dinner parties, the charity galas, the polished reputation, it was all a theater of the absurd, built on the bones of a girl who died trying to do the right thing while I was busy doing the wrong one. I looked at the photograph again, specifically at the way Elias was looming over her, and for the first time in a decade, the fog of misplaced loyalty finally lifted. I realized that I didn't know the man who slept in the bed next to me. I knew a character he had created for my benefit. I was his insurance policy, his alibi, and his fool. As the sound of his car pulling into the driveway echoed through the quiet house, the familiar gravel crunching under his tires,
I didn't feel the usual surge of anxiety. I felt a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm sense of purpose. The woman who stayed silent for 12 years died in that kitchen today. The woman who was going to answer the door was someone Elias wouldn't recognize. I folded the letter, tucked the photo into the pocket of my robe, and stood up to face the monster I had spent a lifetime feeding.
The sound of the front door opening was usually the signal for me to begin the ritual of the perfect wife. The quick smoothing of my hair, the warming of a plate, the soft, rehearsed question about how his day had been at the firm. But today, the heavy thud of the oak door against the frame sounded like the closing of a cell door. I didn't move from the center of the kitchen. I stood there, rooted to the tile, feeling the cold weight of the photograph in my pocket like a live coal. I watched Elias walk down the hallway, his footsteps confident and rhythmic, the sound of a man who owned the world and everyone in it. He stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, his brow furrowing as he took in the sight of me standing there in the middle of the day, the mail scattered on the floor behind me and the stove cold. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice that smooth, practiced baritone that had lulled me into a 12-year trance. He reached out to toss his keys on the counter, but he paused, his eyes narrowing as they caught the intensity in my gaze. For a split second, the mask he wore so perfectly, the mask of the grieving, hard-working pillar of society, slipped, and I saw a flash of the predator underneath, the one who had stood over Lila in the rain. I didn't answer him. I waited until the silence in the room became so heavy it felt like the walls were beginning to sweat. Then slowly, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photograph, holding it up between us like a holy relic or a death warrant. I watched the color drain from his face in a way I had never seen before. It wasn't the gray of shock, but the sickly, translucent white of a man who realized his fortress had finally been breached. His eyes darted to the photo, then to the open envelope on the table, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't have a scripted response. "Where did you get that?" he rasped, his voice losing its melodic charm and turning into something thin and jagged. I stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under my feet, my voice coming out as a low, steady hum that surprised even me. "It doesn't matter where I got it," I said, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What matters is the lie. You told me it was an accident. You cried on this very floor, Elias. You looked me in the eye and told me you pushed her because you were scared. But this photo? This isn't fear. This is an execution." He tried to laugh, a dry, hacking sound that died in his throat, and he took a step toward me, his hands reaching out as if to guide me back into the illusion. "You're overreacting," he started, the old manipulation tactics bubbling to the surface. "Someone is trying to mess with us, to get to my money. You know how people are." But I didn't flinch. I pulled the letter out next, the paper fluttering slightly in the stagnant air. I read the part about the foundation funds out loud, each word feeling like a stone I was throwing at the glass house he had built around me. I watched his posture shift. The slumped shoulders of the misunderstood husband vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. He didn't look like a man in love anymore. He looked like a man calculating the cost of a cleanup. "You should have left the mail on the floor," he whispered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. In that moment, the 12 years of loyalty I had given him felt like a debt I had paid to a devil who was never going to set me free. I realized then that I wasn't his partner, and I wasn't his shield. I was the last witness he needed to silence. The silence that followed my words was no longer the heavy, stagnant air of a secret. It was the pressurized, electric stillness that comes right before a storm breaks. I watched the man I had slept beside for over 4,000 nights dissolve in front of my eyes.
The warmth, the practiced concern, the pillar of the community persona, it all peeled away like wet wallpaper, revealing something skeletal and freezing underneath. Elias didn't move toward me at first. He just stood there, his breathing shallow and rhythmic, his eyes fixed on the letter in my hand with a predatory focus. "You have no idea what you're holding, do you?" he whispered, and the sound of his voice made the hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't the voice of the man who had brought me flowers last Tuesday. It was the voice of the man who had watched a 22-year-old girl stop breathing in the mud. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, and for the first time in 12 years, I didn't feel the urge to comfort him. I felt the primal, screaming instinct to run. I backed away until my shoulder blades hit the cold tile of the kitchen wall, the letter crinkling in my white-knuckled grip. "I was your shield," I rasped, my voice sounding thin and alien in the quiet room. "I gave you my life. I gave you my soul. I lied to the police, Elias. I lied to God for you." He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that contained no humor, only a bitter, jagged edge of contempt. He stepped into my personal space, his shadow completely swallowing me, and he leaned in until I could smell the expensive espresso on his breath. "You didn't do it for me," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You did it for this house. You did it for that car in the driveway and the respect of people who wouldn't look at you twice if I wasn't standing next to you. You did it because you were a coward who liked the life I provided more than the truth." Every word felt like a physical slap, a cruel deconstruction of the lie I had told myself to stay sane. He was stripping away my last shred of moral dignity, forcing me to realize that in his eyes, I wasn't a partner in a tragedy. I was a co-conspirator who had been bought and paid for. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the letter I was holding, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that the "we" he had talked about for 12 years, the "we protect each other," had always been a one-way street. I looked at his hand, the same hand that had supposedly accidentally pushed Leela, and I saw it for what it truly was, a weapon. He wasn't afraid of the truth getting out because of the guilt. He was afraid because it would end his reign. And if I was the only thing standing between him and a prison cell, I was no longer an asset. I was a liability. "You think anyone is going to believe you now?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register as he boxed me in against the wall. 12 years of silence, and suddenly you find your conscience because of an anonymous letter? You're just as guilty as I am in the eyes of the law. If I go down, you go down with me. Or," he trailed off, his gaze drifting toward the heavy knife block on the counter just a few inches away. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. I was disposable. To a man who could plan an execution to protect a ledger, a wife was just another piece of evidence that needed to be managed. The perfect life wasn't a fortress, it was a cage, and the lock had just turned. The air in the kitchen had grown so thin it felt like trying to breathe through a shroud. I could hear the rhythmic, mocking tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer, each second a hammer blow against the coffin of the life I had known. Elias didn't move. He didn't have to. His physical presence was a wall of muscle and expensive wool that I couldn't climb over, and his words were a psychic cage I couldn't break out of. "Think about it, Clara," he whispered, using my name with a softness that felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. "Think about the headlines. Local philanthropist's wife confesses to decades of deceit. They won't see you as a victim. They'll see you as the woman who sat in the front row of church every Sunday while a girl's body rotted because of your silence. They'll eat you alive." He was right. And that was the cruelest part of his trap. He had spent 12 years weaving my identity so tightly into his own that to unravel him was to shred myself. I looked at the knife block, the dark wooden handle of the chef's knife sitting just inches from his hand, and I realized that the choice he was offering wasn't a choice at all. It was an ultimatum. I could stay in the shadow of his protection and continue to be his silent accomplice, or I could step into the light and be destroyed by the very truth I had helped him bury. I looked up at him, and for the first time I didn't see the man who had promised to love and honor me. I saw the man who had calculated the trajectory of Lila's fall. I saw the man who probably practiced his confession to me in the car on the way home that night, making sure he sounded just broken enough to earn my pity. My stomach turned with a wave of nausea so violent I had to lean my head back against the cold tile to keep from fainting. Every "I love you," every anniversary gift, every whispered plan for our retirement, it was all currency he had used to buy my soul. He wasn't just a killer, he was a thief who had stolen 12 years of my life and replaced them with a hollow, gilded imitation. The terror that had been paralyzing me began to shift, slowly, into a cold, hard coal of resentment. If I was going down, if the world was going to see me as a monster, then I was going to make sure they saw him for exactly what he was first. I wasn't going to be his disposable shield any longer. I was going to be the crack in the foundation that finally brought the whole house down. I felt my fingers brush against the heavy ceramic base of the fruit bowl on the counter behind me. It was a small, desperate thought, but it was the first one that felt like mine in a decade. Elias saw the change in my eyes, the flicker of defiance that replaced the glazed look of the submissive wife, and his expression shifted from manipulation to pure, unadulterated aggression. He reached for the letter, his fingers snaking out to snatch the last piece of evidence I had, but I pulled it back, pinning it against the wall behind me. "You're not taking this," I said, my voice finally finding a register that didn't shake. "And you're not taking another second of my life." The mask didn't just slip then, it shattered. Elias lunged, his hand catching the front of my robe, the fabric tearing with a sound like a scream. In that moment of chaotic movement, the house I had loved felt like a stranger's territory, full of sharp corners and dead ends. I knew if I stayed in this kitchen, I wouldn't make it to sunset. I had to choose the safety of the lie or the lethal risk of the truth. I looked at the back door, the glass pane reflecting the dying orange light of the sun, and I realized that the only way to be free was to break every single thing I had spent 12 years trying to keep whole. Adrenaline is a cold electric current that doesn't just sharpen your senses, it burns away every civilized thought until all that's left is the raw, pulsing need to survive. When Elias lunged, the sound of my silk robe tearing was the final snap of the tether that had kept me bound to him for 12 years. I didn't think, I didn't weigh the consequences or the headlines or the shame. I simply ducked under his reaching arm, my body moving with a fluid, desperate grace I hadn't possessed since the night at the ravine. I felt the wind of his hand narrowly missing the back of my neck, the force of his momentum causing him to slam into the marble countertop with a heavy, metallic thud that echoed through the kitchen. I didn't look back to see if he was hurt. I didn't care. I turned and bolted toward the back door, my feet slapping against the cold tile and then the hardwood of the dining room. Every piece of furniture I had carefully curated, the antique sideboard, the velvet-lined chairs, the crystal vase that had cost more than a small car, they weren't symbols of my status anymore. They were obstacles. They were the bars of the cage I was finally breaking out of. I could hear him behind me, the heavy, rhythmic thud of his leather shoes regaining their footing, his breathing coming in ragged, furious bursts. "Clara, get back here!" he roared, and the sound of my name in his mouth felt like a curse, a final attempt to reclaim his property. I reached the heavy glass door that led to the patio, my fingers fumbling with the deadbolt. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my ribs, hammering so hard I thought it would shatter my bone. I could see the orange sun dipping below the tree line outside, a beautiful, indifferent world that had no idea I was fighting for my life in the shadows of a perfect home. The lock was stiff. It was a security bolt Elias had installed himself to keep me safe. And for a terrifying second, it wouldn't budge. I let out a low, guttural sob of frustration, my vision blurring with tears of pure terror. I heard him enter the dining room, the sound of a chair being knocked over as he scrambled to reach me. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, his voice closer now, dangerously close. "You won't survive the truth, Clara. I'm the only thing protecting you." With a scream of pure, concentrated rage, I threw my entire weight against the bolt. It gave way with a sharp, metallic crack that felt like a bone breaking. I ripped the door open, the cool evening air hitting my sweat-soaked face like a benediction. I didn't stop to put on shoes. I didn't grab my purse. I just ran. I plummeted down the porch steps and onto the grass, the blades sharp and cold against my skin. I didn't head for the car. He had the keys, and he would corner me in the driveway before I could even start the engine. Instead, I ran toward the tree line, toward the dense, unmanicured woods that bordered our property, the very place I had avoided for 12 years because the shadows reminded me too much of his secrets. I could hear him behind me, the heavy, rhythmic thud of his leather shoes regaining their footing, his breathing coming in ragged, furious bursts. "You ripped our souls apart!" he shrieked, as I reached the dense undergrowth, the first wall of the shadows, his voice breaking with pain and fury. I let myself fall into the tangled mass of leaves and brambles, the cold earth immediately claiming my bare feet. He would never find me in here. This was the kingdom where the secrets lived, the world he had spent 12 years trying to keep me from. The darkness closed in around me like a black velvet shroud. I was just one of the shadows now, and I had his truth. He might be a pillar of the community, but I was the crack that would bring it all down. The transition from the polished, climate-controlled vacuum of the house to the raw, indifferent chaos of the woods was a physical shock that nearly stopped my heart. The ground was a treacherous landscape of rotted leaves, hidden roots, and sharp stones that sliced into my bare soles with every frantic step. I didn't feel the pain yet. The adrenaline was a numbing frost in my veins, a chemical shield that kept me moving as I plunged deeper into the undergrowth. Behind me, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of Elias's boots hitting the porch steps, a sound that had once meant safety, but now sounded like the steady beat of a war drum. I didn't head for the main path. I knew he'd expect that. He was a man who understood the geometry of his land, a man who had spent years walking these trails to clear his head after his stressful days at the firm. I veered off into the thicket, the thorns of the wild blackberry bushes tearing at the hem of my robe and scratching my shins, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I could hear him shouting my name, his voice no longer pleading or manipulative, but stripped down to a raw, command-tone authority that made the woods feel like his personal hunting ground. "Clara, you're going to freeze out there. Just come back and we can talk about this." His voice boomed, echoing off the trees. It was the lie of the predator, the soft call to lure the prey back into the clearing. I didn't answer. I pressed my back against the rough, freezing bark of an ancient oak tree, my chest heaving so violently I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to stifle the sound of my own sobbing breaths. The darkness here wasn't just an absence of light. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to swallow the very air. Then I saw it, the sharp, cold blade of a flashlight beam cutting through the trees about 50 yards behind me. It moved with a terrifying professional precision, sweeping across the forest floor, illuminating the silver undersides of leaves and the discarded husks of fallen branches. He wasn't just looking for me, he was tracking me. He knew the way the grass bent when someone ran. He knew the sound of a snapped twig. For 12 years, I had admired his attention to detail, but now that same meticulousness was a death sentence. I began to crawl, my knees sinking into the damp, freezing mud that smelled of decay, the same smell Elias had brought home on his shoes 12 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was literally sinking into the grave he had dug for our secrets. Every time the flashlight beam swung in my direction, I pressed my face into the dirt, praying that the dark fabric of my robe would blend into the shadows. I felt a sharp, jagged rock dig into my palm, but I squeezed my hand shut, welcoming the sting because it reminded me that I was still alive, still moving, still fighting. I realized then that Elias wasn't just hunting a wife who knew too much. He was hunting the only evidence of his true nature. As long as I was breathing, his pillar of the community status was a house of cards waiting for a breeze. I watched the light bounce off the trunks, getting closer, the sound of his footsteps crunching through the dry leaves like a slow-motion countdown. He was whistling, a low, tuneless sound that chilled me more than the wind. It was the sound of a man who was enjoying the hunt, a man who felt no remorse, only the cold thrill of maintaining control. I looked ahead through the tangled branches and saw a dip in the terrain, the old drainage creek that led toward the boundary fence of the neighboring estate. It was a steep, muddy drop-off, overgrown with ivy and slick with the runoff from the recent rains. If I could reach it, I could disappear into the hollows of the bank where the light couldn't reach. But to get there, I had to cross a small, moonlit clearing, a 10-foot stretch of open ground where I would be completely exposed. I looked back at the flashlight beam, now barely 30 feet away, the light catching the mist of my own breath. It was now or never. I didn't think about the headlines or the shame or the 12 years of silence. I thought about Leela. I thought about the girl who didn't get a chance to run. I pushed off from the oak tree, my legs screaming with exhaustion, and I threw myself into the open, my heart a deafening roar in my ears. The light swung toward me, the beam hitting my back like a physical blow, and I heard his voice rise in a triumphant shout, "I see you, Clara!" I didn't look back. I reached the edge of the creek and let myself fall, tumbling into the dark, wet void of the ravine, praying that the earth would hide me one last time. The fall was a chaotic blur of gravity and terror, a sequence of slamming into wet earth, clutching at slick moss that tore away in my fingernails, and the jarring impact of my ribs hitting a protruding root. When I finally hit the bottom, the air was knocked out of me in a ragged, silent gasp. I lay there in the freezing muck, the smell of rot and wet stone filling my senses, and for a terrifying second I thought I had died. The silence at the bottom of the ravine was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press the very soul out of my body. But then the sound returned, the low, persistent gurgle of the drainage creek nearby and the distant, rhythmic crunch of boots on the gravel above. My heart, which had almost stopped in the descent, began to thud with a slow, agonizing heaviness. I realized with a jolt of bone-deep horror that I wasn't just in a ditch. I had fallen into the exact geographical ghost of our secret. I was at the base of the slope where Lila had taken her last breath 12 years ago. The jagged rocks surrounding me weren't just stones. They were the teeth of the lie I had helped Elias sharpen. I tried to move, but a sharp, hot needle of pain shot through my ankle, pinning me to the mud. I let out a low, involuntary whimper, and the flashlight beam from above instantly snapped toward the sound. It swept across the debris, the rotted logs, the discarded soda cans, the ancient rusted wire, until it hit me. The light was so bright it felt like a physical weight, blinding me, turning the world into a stark, high-contrast nightmare of white light and bottomless shadows. "I told you, Clara," Elias's voice floated down from the rim, sounding eerily calm, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather over a glass of scotch. "I told you the truth was a dangerous place. Now look at you. You followed her all the way down. Is this what you wanted? To end up exactly where she did?" He began to descend, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't rushing anymore. He knew I was trapped by the terrain and my own broken body. He moved with the confidence of a man who had choreographed this scene a decade ago and was simply performing the encore. As he got closer, the light from his flashlight began to illuminate the specific patch of ground where I lay. I looked down, my fingers digging into the muck, and I saw something white and curved poking out from the silt near my hand. At first, I thought it was a stone, but as the light shifted, I realized it was a fragment of a plastic hair clip, the kind a 22-year-old girl would wear to keep her bangs out of her eyes while she worked at a cafe. The sight of that small, cheap piece of plastic hit me harder than the fall ever could. It was a physical tether to the girl I had allowed to be forgotten. For 12 years, I had pictured her as a concept, a mistake to be managed, but seeing that clip made her real again. It made the blood on Elias's shoes real. It made my own cowardice real. The rage that had been simmering in my chest sparked into a roaring flame, a heat that defied the freezing water soaking into my skin. I didn't care about the house anymore. I didn't care about the pillar of the community. I just wanted him to stop talking. I wanted the silence to end. He reached the bottom, the heavy thud of his boots stopping just a few feet from my head. He didn't reach down to help me. He just stood there, silhouetted against the moon, looking down at me with a mixture of pity and cold calculation. "Give me the letter, Clara," he said, his hand outstretched. "Give it to me, and we can go home. I'll tell everyone you fell while we were walking. I'll take care of you, just like I always have. We can fix this. We've fixed it before." But I looked up at him, the light reflecting in my eyes, and I didn't see my husband. I saw the monster who planned a murder and then invited me to live in the house he built on top of it. I realized then that the only way to truly kill a secret is to stop being afraid of the ruin it brings. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the damp, crinkled paper of the letter, and I felt a strange, terrifyingly beautiful sense of peace. "No," I whispered, my voice echoing off the walls of the ravine, sounding stronger than it had in a decade. "The only thing we're fixing tonight, Elias, is the silence." The air at the bottom of the ravine was thick with the scent of ancient dampness and the metallic tang of blood, my own and the ghostly memory of Leela's. Elias didn't move when I said no. He didn't explode in a rage, and he didn't try to grab me. Instead, he simply sighed, a sound of profound, weary disappointment that made my skin crawl more than any scream ever could.
He looked down at me, the flashlight beam in his hand, trembling just enough to reveal the slight tremor in his fingers. "You always were too sentimental, Clara," he whispered, his voice a low, melodic thrum that vibrated against the stone walls. "You fell in love with a version of me that didn't exist because you couldn't handle the reality of what it takes to build a life like ours. You think this letter is a weapon? It's a suicide note for everything you've ever known. If you give this to the police, you aren't just sending me to a cell, you're sending yourself to the gutter. You'll be the woman who helped to kill her for 12 years. Do you really think anyone will listen to your excuses now?" He was right, and that was the jagged edge of his trap. He had spent over 4,000 days making sure my guilt was as deep as his. But as I sat there in the freezing mud, clutching the wet, crinkled paper in my pocket, I realized that the gutter was exactly where I belonged. I had lived in a mansion built on a grave, and the luxury had been a slower, more suffocating death than any prison cell could ever be. I looked at the plastic hair clip near my hand, that small, cheap relic of a life cut short, and I felt a surge of strength that didn't come from adrenaline, but from a profound, bone-deep honesty. I looked up at the man I had protected, the man I had lied for, the man I had shared a bed with while a girl's ghost sat between us, and I didn't see a husband. I saw a parasitic ghost. "I'm not a coward anymore, Elias," I said, my voice rising above the roar of the water, steady and sharp. "I'd rather spend the rest of my life in a cell for what I did than spend another second in that house for what you did. You didn't just kill Leela, you killed me too. But the difference is I'm finally waking up." The mask finally completely shattered. Elias lunged toward me, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice, his hands reaching for my throat to silence the one voice he couldn't control. But the mud that had trapped me became his undoing. As he stepped forward, his heavy boots skidded on the slick moss-covered stones, the same treacherous ground that had claimed Leela. He lost his footing, his arms flailing for a second as he tried to catch himself on the air, and he went down hard, his head striking the same jagged outcropping of rock that had ended a 22-year-old girl's dreams 12 years prior. There was a sickening, wet crack that echoed through the ravine, a sound so final it seemed to stop the very flow of the creek. He slumped into the water, his flashlight rolling away and coming to rest face up, its beam pointing straight into the canopy of the trees above like a signal flare. I didn't move. I watched the water turn dark around him, the current pulling at his expensive wool coat, and I realized that the cycle had finally closed. The ravine had claimed its second victim, and the silence had finally been broken by the sound of its own weight collapsing.
The silence didn't last. By morning, the woods were crawling with lights, but they weren't Elias's flashlight anymore. They were the flashing blues and reds of a world that finally knew the truth. I didn't hide. I didn't run. I sat on the damp earth until the investigators found me, the letter and the photograph still clutched in my frozen fingers. The investigation into Elias's death opened the floodgates. With the evidence from the letter, the police finally searched the sub-basement of our home, finding the ledgers Leela had died trying to expose, proof of millions stolen from the very charities Elias pretended to lead. But more importantly, they found the physical evidence they had missed 12 years ago, a scrap of his clothing caught in the brush, a detail he had paid to have suppressed back then. Justice is a slow, cold thing, but for Leela it finally arrived. Her death was officially reclassified from an accident to a homicide. The community that once worshipped Elias stood in shock as the man they called a pillar was revealed to be a predator. As for me, my 12 years of silence carried a heavy price. I was charged as an accessory after the fact. I didn't fight it. I stood in that courtroom and looked Leela's mother in the eye, and for the first time in over a decade, I didn't have to look away. I am serving my time now, but these iron bars feel lighter than the silk sheets of that mansion ever did. Leela's name is no longer a secret whispered in the dark. It is a story of a girl who was right all along. I lost my life, my home, and my reputation, but I found my voice, and in the end, that was the only thing worth saving. Thank you for walking through this dark chapter with us today on Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. Leela's story is a reminder that the truth doesn't have an expiration date, it only has a boiling point. We often think we are protecting ourselves by staying silent, but a lie is just a slow-moving poison that eventually consumes everyone it touches. If this story moved you, or if it made you think about a secret you've been carrying, please like this video and share it. Your support helps us tell the stories that usually stay buried in the dark. We are a growing community and your voice matters here. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're with us when the next secret is revealed. Before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Clara deserved her prison sentence, or was her confession enough to redeem her? And if you received a letter like that, would you have the courage to burn your whole life down for a girl you barely knew? Let's talk about it below. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay honest, and remember, some echoes never fade. We'll see you in the next episode.